The moment my daughter-in-law held up my gift at the graduation dinner, looked at the plain brown envelope in her hand, and said, "Oh, Helen, you really didn't have to." I knew from her tone that she meant exactly the opposite. She genuinely wished I hadn't. What happened next? In front of 37 family members and friends gathered around the long table at the Riverside Grill in Kelowna is something I will never forget for as long as I live. She laughed, passed the envelope to my son without opening it, and said, "You deal with it, babe. Probably just a card." Then she turned back to her champagne. What Melissa didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except my oldest friend Patricia Okafor, was that inside that envelope was something I had spent 11 years quietly preparing, a document that represented every overtime shift I had worked at the hospital, every vacation I had skipped, every winter coat I had worn 2 seasons past its time. A registered investment account worth just over $340,000, fully transferable, already designated in my son's name. By the time dessert arrived, Melissa would realize what she had dismissed. But by then, I had already made a decision she would spend a long time reckoning with. My name is Helen Marsh, and I want to tell you the full story. Not because I want sympathy, and not because I want to make anyone look bad, but because I think a lot of people, especially women my age, will recognize pieces of this in their own lives. And because some lessons only make sense when you tell them from the beginning. I was 63 years old the spring my son graduated from his 2nd degree. I had been a widow for 9 years by then. My husband, Douglas, had died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of death that gives you no warning and no goodbye. One moment he was reading the paper at the kitchen table in our home in Penticton. The next moment he was gone. I don't like to dwell on grief. It doesn't move anything forward. But I will say this. Losing Douglas when our son, James, was only 26 changed the shape of my life in ways I'm still discovering. James was our only child. He had been close to his father in the quiet, steady way that fathers and sons sometimes are. After the funeral, we leaned on each other more than either of us admitted. What I did in the years after Douglas died was work. Not to avoid feeling things, but because it was what I knew how to do. I was a registered nurse at Kelowna General. I had been on my feet in that building for over 20 years. I picked up extra shifts, covered maternity leaves, volunteered for holiday rotations. My colleagues used to joke that I practically lived there. I didn't mind. The work gave me purpose, and the money gave me options. I was quietly building toward something. Douglas and I had never been wealthy. We were comfortable, careful, Canadian middle class. A term that means you own a modest home, you save where you can, you don't carry credit card debt if you can possibly help it, and you understand the difference between wanting something and needing it. When Douglas died, I inherited his RRSP and a modest life insurance policy. I could have spent it on something for myself. Instead, I added it carefully to what I was already putting aside and kept going. The truth was, I had a private goal, a number I was working toward. I had watched James grow into a responsible, thoughtful man. He worked hard. He was kind. He called me every Sunday evening without being reminded, which in my experience says more about a person's character than almost anything else. When he told me he had enrolled in a graduate program in environmental planning at UBC, I cried a little, then put another $100 a month into his designated fund without telling him. I never spoke about the money to James. I didn't want him to feel beholden or to change his choices based on what he thought I might give him. I wanted him to build his life honestly. And then, when the time was right, I wanted to hand him something that would quietly lift the weight of debt off his shoulders. That was the dream I carried through every night shift, every aching pair of feet. Every year, I drove my 2009 Civic past the car dealerships without stopping. I first met Melissa Cartwright about 2 years before the graduation dinner. James called me on a Sunday, which was typical, but his voice was different, lighter. He said, "Mum, I want you to meet someone." I laughed. "Is she good to you?" He said, "She's remarkable." And I believed him, because James didn't exaggerate. The first time I met Melissa, she was perfectly pleasant. She was a marketing director for a property development company in Vancouver. She was polished and quick, and exactly the kind of woman who knows how to make an impression in the first 10 minutes of meeting someone. She asked about my work, complimented my home, mentioned that she had always admired nurses. Everything she said was correct, appropriate, frictionless. I noticed that she talked about her job a great deal. Not in a boring way. She was genuinely engaging, but in a way that seemed to require you to understand that she was successful. She mentioned her salary once, casually, in the context of a story about something else, the way people do when they want you to know the number without seeming like they're telling you the number. I filed that away, without comment. Over the following year, small things accumulated. I visited James and Melissa in their apartment in Vancouver twice. Both times, Melissa received me warmly on the surface but grew slightly restless when conversations lingered too long on James's childhood or on Douglas. Once, when I was telling a story about James learning to skate on the pond behind Patricia's property in the Okanagan, Melissa checked her phone midway through and then smiled at me with the particular brightness of someone who has stopped listening but is being polite about it. I told myself I was being too sensitive. People my generation sometimes romanticize the idea of the daughter-in-law they never had. We build up a picture in our minds, a warm relationship over tea, shared confidences, an easy closeness, and then feel the loss of something that was never really promised to us. I tried to hold that perspective carefully. I tried not to project. But then came the kitchen conversation. I had driven down to Vancouver to help James and Melissa move into a new apartment. We spent the better part of a Saturday carrying boxes and assembling furniture. And by evening, I was tired in the way only people past 60 understand. The kind of tired that settles in your knees and stays there. I was in the kitchen unpacking a box of dishes when Melissa came in. She looked at the plates I was stacking and said, "Oh, are those the ones from your place?" I said yes, I had brought a few extras I wasn't using anymore. She picked one up, turned it over, looked at the back. "Put it down. They're a bit dated, aren't they?" We were going to go with something more minimal. She smiled, but that's very thoughtful. She left the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, holding a plate my mother had given me at my own bridal shower 41 years ago. I put it back in the box. I didn't bring it up again. That was the first moment I knew something was off. Not dramatically wrong, not unforgivable, just off. The way a note sounds when an instrument is very slightly out of tune. Most people won't notice. But if you've spent enough years listening, you hear it every time. Over the next several months, there were other notes. Melissa once referred to Penticton as charming in a small-town way, in a tone that treated smallness as a mild affliction. At James's birthday dinner, which I had organized, cooked for, and driven 4 hours to attend, she arrived 40 minutes late without apology, and then redirected the conversation away from James's work, which she had privately told me she found a bit idealistic, toward a project her own firm had recently won. James laughed along. He always laughed along. That was one of his father's qualities too. A deep reluctance to see conflict where he didn't have to. The harder thing, the thing I didn't say to anyone except Patricia, was that Melissa seemed to have a particular way of treating people based on what she perceived their social position to be. With James's colleagues from UBC, academics, policy people, researchers, she was engaged and curious. With the plumber who came to fix something during one of my visits, she spoke in clipped sentences and left the room quickly. With me, she was courteous in the way you are, with someone you have assessed and found to occupy a category that doesn't require much investment. I don't think she was a cruel person. I want to be fair about that. I think she had simply never been taught to see value in people the way I had been taught. Through 30 years of nursing, where you learn very quickly that the person in the bed with the worn shoes and the quiet family might be the most remarkable human being you've ever met. Melissa had learned a different set of lessons somewhere along the way. Lessons about positioning and presentation, and what things signal about people. The graduation dinner was planned for a Friday evening in late May. James had completed his master's degree with distinction. I was more proud than I knew how to say out loud. Patricia drove down from Penticton with me. We checked into a hotel near the waterfront, and that afternoon, while James was at a departmental reception. I sat in the hotel room with my briefcase open on the bed and the envelope in my hands. Patricia watched me from the chair by the window. She had known Douglas. She had known me since we were young mothers pushing strollers down the same street in 1988. She was the only person in the world who knew the full number, the full amount, the full plan. "You don't have to do it tonight," she said. "I know." I turned the envelope over. "But I've been planning this for 11 years. Patricia smiled. She had the kind of smile that carries a whole conversation inside it. "Just be sure about who you're giving it to." I understood what she meant. In the previous months, I had started to see things more clearly. James and Melissa had been together for 4 years. There had been quiet talk of engagement. I had watched how Melissa spoke to James about money, not cruelly, but with a certain assumption of authority. She earned more than he did, and she let that fact do small amounts of invisible work in their relationship. She made the larger financial decisions. She chose their neighborhood, their furniture, their holidays. James deferred to her in ways I recognized from other couples, and had learned to find quietly troubling. The question Patricia was really asking was whether I was sure that what I gave James would remain James's. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I tucked the envelope into my handbag, and we drove to the Riverside Grill. The dinner was large and festive. James's supervisor was there, along with several of his classmates and their families. Melissa's parents, a couple from North Vancouver named Hugh and Cecile Cartwright, and a scattering of extended family on both sides. I was seated midway down the table. Not at the far end, not beside James, midway. Melissa had organized the seating. I noticed that her parents were flanking James directly. I took my seat without comment. The evening was genuinely lovely in parts. James gave a small, funny speech about field work and mud, and why he would never again wear white socks in a wetland. People laughed. I laughed. For a while, I forgot the small accumulated weight of the previous months, and simply felt glad to be his mother. When the gift moment arrived, it was informal. James had mentioned earlier that a few people had brought envelopes or cards, and he and Melissa were simply going to open them at the table. One by one, people passed things down. A check from Hugh and Cecile, a gift card from a colleague, a small framed print from a cousin. Then my envelope reached Melissa's end of the table before James could take it. She picked it up, saw my name on the outside, and smiled in my direction. "Oh, Helen, you really didn't have to." The tone, as I said, was unmistakable. She looked at it. A plain brown letter envelope, the kind you buy at any Staples, sealed and unadorned, and something in her expression shifted. Not contempt exactly. More like a gentle, condescending dismissal. The slight softening of the eyes that means, "Sass, I am not expecting much from this." "You deal with it, babe," she said to James, handing it across. "Probably just a card." A few people around them chuckled. The polite, faintly uncomfortable chuckle that fills a gap when someone says something slightly off. James took the envelope. He looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He opened it. I watched his face as he read the first line of the letter from my financial institution. I watched him read it again, then again. He looked up at me. His expression was something I had never seen on him before. Not quite shock, not quite joy. Something deeper. Something that moved past both of those things into a place I recognized from nursing. The expression of someone absorbing a truth that is restructuring everything around it. "Mum." His voice was barely above a whisper. Melissa leaned over. She read the first line. Then she sat very still. The table had gone quiet. People closest to them could sense that something was happening. Patricia, 2 seats away from me, quietly put her hand on mine. "James," I said, from my end of the table. And my voice stayed steady because I had decided it would. "That account has been in your name for 11 years. It belongs to you. I just needed you to be grown into the person who would use it well." I paused. "I think you are." He put the letter down on the table and pressed both hands over his face for a moment. When he lifted his head, his eyes were wet. Melissa said nothing. She was looking at the letter, then at me, then at the letter again. The pleasant brightness she usually wore had dropped away completely, and underneath it was an expression I found very difficult to read. Not remorse, not joy for James, something private and calculating that she pulled back behind her face almost immediately. I smiled at my son. Then I picked up my wine glass and let the conversation around us resume. I didn't stay long after dinner. I hugged James at the door of the restaurant. He held on for a moment longer than usual. I don't know what to say, he told me. You don't have to say anything, I said. Just do something good with it. Patricia and I drove back to the hotel. Neither of us spoke much. At some point, she said, he looked overwhelmed. I said yes. She said, she looked like she was calculating. I said I knew. That night, lying in the dark of the hotel room, I made a call I had been turning over in my mind since before dinner. I called my financial advisor, a meticulous woman named Roberta Fenn, who had managed my accounts for nearly a decade. I told her what had happened. I told her what I had seen on Melissa's face, and then I asked her a question I never thought I would ask. Roberta listened without interruption. Then she said, the designation can be amended. You have until the paperwork is formally transferred. I said, I know, I'm not sure what I want to do yet. I just need you to know that I might call. She said, I'll be available. I hung up and stared at the ceiling for a long time. This was not a small thing I was considering. 11 years. Every sacrifice, every skipped holiday, every extra overnight shift at 60 years old when my body wanted very much to stop. All of it had gone into that account for James. Not for Melissa, not for their household budget, not for a renovation of the apartment she had already chosen without consulting anyone. For James. The question I was sitting with was not about money. It was about what I had actually seen in that restaurant, and whether I trusted what I saw. I had worked in healthcare long enough to know the difference between a person having a complicated moment and a person revealing their character. Both can look similar from the outside. One passes, the other doesn't. 3 days later, James came to my hotel. Melissa did not come with him. He sat across from me at the small table by the window, holding his coffee in both hands the way he had done since he was a teenager, and he said, Mum, she's upset. I said, I imagine she is. He looked at me carefully. She feels like you made her look bad in front of everyone. I considered that for a moment. James, she made a comment about your gift before she opened it. I didn't do anything. He was quiet. Then, she didn't know what was in it. No, I said. She didn't. And that's exactly the point. He didn't answer right away. That was Douglas in him too, the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable sentence rather than immediately talking over it. She wants to apologize, he said finally. For what? I asked, not unkindly. Genuinely. He looked uncertain. For what she said. At dinner. Okay, I said. And what does she think she said? He frowned slightly. She said it was probably just a card. Yes, I said. What she said was, you deal with it, babe, probably just a card. What she communicated was that a gift from your mother was not worth her attention. In front of your friends, your supervisor, her parents, and mine. I kept my voice even. If the account had contained a greeting card, James, would she be apologizing right now? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched something shift in his face. Quietly. The way things shift when a person starts to re-examine a memory they thought they had already filed away. I don't know, he said. I think you do, I said gently. We sat in silence for a while after that. Outside, it was raining the way Vancouver rains in May, persistently, without drama. Eventually James said, she can be hard on people. I know, I said. I've defended her to people who've said that. I know that too. He looked at me. Why didn't you ever tell me? I reached across and touched his hand. Because you loved her, and you were happy. Or I thought you were. He didn't correct me. That worried me more than if he had. Melissa came to the hotel the following afternoon, without James. She was dressed impeccably, as always, and she sat across from me, with her hands folded on the table in a posture that suggested she had rehearsed this. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't meant to diminish my gift. She said she had been distracted that evening and hadn't been thinking. She said it in the specific, complete way that people say things when they have thought carefully about what to admit and what to leave out. I listened. When she finished, I said, I appreciate you coming, Melissa. She seemed to relax slightly. I said, can I ask you something? She said, of course. I said, when you passed the envelope to James and said it was probably just a card, What were you thinking about me in that moment? She blinked. I wasn't thinking anything. It's all right if you were, I said. I'm not asking so I can be hurt by the answer. I'm asking because I'd like to know where we actually stand. The room was very quiet. Slissa looked at the table, then at the window, then at her hands. I waited, because I had spent 30 years waiting at bedsides, and I knew how to give a silence room to breathe. Finally, she said, I think I assumed you wouldn't give something significant. I nodded slowly. Why? She hesitated. Because of. She stopped. Started again. I suppose I thought. The envelope wasn't. Another stop. You thought the packaging told you what was inside, I said. She looked up. Yes, and the packaging told you something about me. A long pause. Yes. Her voice had gone very quiet. I looked at her carefully. There was something different in her expression now. Not the calculated brightness, not the retreated look from the restaurant. Something uncomfortable. Uncomfortable in the way that precedes honesty. I've misjudged you, she said. It came out simply. Not as a performance, just a sentence that had apparently been sitting there waiting. Yes, I said. You have. For a while. She didn't argue. I had expected her to. She didn't. We talked for another hour. Not about the account, not about money. About the kitchen plates. About the story of James skating that she'd stopped listening to. About the things I had noticed and set aside. She was pale by the end of it. Not from embarrassment, I thought. From genuine recognition. The particular pallor of a person seeing themselves from outside for the first time. When she left, I sat for a long time. I thought about Douglas. About the things he used to say about people. That most of them aren't bad, they're just unexamined. That the ones who eventually examine themselves are usually worth the patience it takes to wait for them. I called Roberta Fenn the following morning. I told her I still wanted to transfer the account to James, but I wanted to add a condition. A minor legal structure. A spousal agreement requirement, so that neither party could access the funds for major purposes without the other's full and documented consent. It wasn't punitive. It was protective. For both of them, actually. Roberta said it was straightforward to arrange. The paperwork was completed 2 weeks later. I sent James a letter explaining the condition and why I had added it. I told him it wasn't distrust of him. It was a structure that would protect the partnership of their marriage if they chose to honor it that way. He called me the evening he received it. He didn't mention Melissa by name. He just said, I think I understand, Mum. And then he said something that surprised me. I've been seeing some things differently lately. I didn't press him on what he meant. I didn't need to. The seeds of honest seeing, once they take hold, tend to do their own growing. It's been 14 months since the dinner at the Riverside Grill. James and Melissa are still together. I don't know everything about their marriage, and I've stopped trying to know. What I do know is that James calls me on Sunday evenings, as he always has, but he talks differently now. More openly. He mentions disagreements without smoothing them over. He asks for my opinion on things he would have kept to himself before. Whatever shifted in him that spring seems to have taken root. Melissa and I are not close. I won't pretend otherwise. But she sent me a card at Christmas, handwritten, a few lines, no grand declarations. She thanked me for being honest with her last May. She said she had thought about our conversation a great deal. She said she was trying to do better by people. I read it twice. Then I put it on my kitchen windowsill, where I could see it from the table while I had my morning coffee. Patricia asked me once, not long after all of this, whether I regretted giving the account to James after everything that had happened. I thought about it for a genuine moment. Then I said no. The gift was always for James. James is a good man who is learning, as we all do, to see more clearly. Whatever comes of his marriage, he will have a foundation that nobody can take from him. That was the only thing I ever wanted to give him. The account I had built over 11 years wasn't the real gift, though. The real gift was the choice I was given. To see who people are before they know they're being seen. To learn the value of patience. To understand that the plainest envelope sometimes carries the most weight, and perhaps most importantly, that a quiet exit from a restaurant on a Friday evening in May can say more than anything you might say out loud.